In the late 19th century, a bottle of ketchup could be more dangerous than it looked. Inside dark glass containers, sauces made from bruised tomatoes, uneven recipes, and poorly cleaned equipment continued fermenting after they had been sealed. Bottles swelled, leaked, and sometimes burst on pantry shelves. Artificial dyes disguised pale ingredients, while chemical preservatives helped questionable products survive long journeys to market. Consumers saw a familiar condiment, but they had no way of knowing what had been hidden inside it. Then, in 1876, one manufacturer placed his ketchup inside a clear glass bottle and invited customers to look directly at what others preferred to hide. That decision would help transform a suspicious factory sauce into one of the most recognizable products in American food. Yet the strangest part of this story is that ketchup did not begin with Heinz, America, or even tomatoes. Its earliest ancestors were dark fermented fish sauces, traded across Asia, centuries earlier. How did a pungent seasoning, made from fish and salt, cross oceans, repeatedly abandon its own ingredients, survive industrial scandals, and become the red sauce poured over billions of burgers and fries? Long before ketchup became sweet, red, and thick, coastal communities across Asia were preserving fish in salt. Packed into jars and left to ferment, the fish slowly broke down into a dark, powerful liquid, rich in salt and savory flavor. It kept far longer than fresh seafood, making it valuable in hot climates and useful aboard trading ships. Somewhere along the maritime routes connecting southern China and Southeast Asia, European sailors encountered sauces of this kind and carried the idea westward. The exact origin of the word ketchup is still debated, but many historians connect it to Asian terms for fermented fish sauce. What mattered most was not a single recipe. It was the concept, a concentrated, long-lasting seasoning capable of transforming plain food. When British merchants and sailors returned home, they brought back the memory of that flavor, but not the ingredients or knowledge required to reproduce it exactly. So they began inventing their own versions. In Britain, the imported idea became something entirely new. Without the same fish, climate, or fermentation traditions, cooks tried to recreate the deep, savory flavor using ingredients they already understood. Mushrooms were salted until they released a dark liquid. Walnuts, oysters, anchovies, beer, wine, and spices appeared in other recipes. These early ketchups were usually thin, brown, salty, and sharply seasoned, closer to Worcestershire sauce than the sweet red condiment sold today. By the 18th century, ketchup had become less a single recipe than a method for producing concentrated flavor. That flexibility helped it spread through British kitchens and later across the Atlantic. But it also erased much of the sauce's Asian identity. A seasoning born from maritime trade was being rewritten to suit European ingredients and tastes. Ketchup's greatest strength was never one particular ingredient. It was the ability to change whenever geography, technology, or necessity demanded it. In Asia, it had been built around fermented fish. In Britain, it became a sauce of mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, and spices. Each transformation carried ketchup farther from its original identity, yet also allowed it to survive in places where the original recipe could not. That pattern would define the rest of its history. Ketchup would repeatedly abandon one form, adopt another, and emerge more powerful than before. Tomatoes had not yet entered the bottle. When they finally did, they would not simply become another ingredient. They would redefine what the world believed ketchup was. Tomatoes entered the story in the early 19th century. But they did not immediately create the ketchup we know today. In 1812, American horticulturist James Meese published one of the earliest known recipes for tomato ketchup, using what he called love apples. His version combined tomato pulp with spices and brandy, but it contained neither vinegar nor sugar. It was closer to a seasoned tomato sauce than the thick, sweet condiment found in modern bottles. Still, the idea spread quickly. American cooks began boiling, straining, salting, and seasoning tomatoes, creating recipes that varied from household to household. The tomato offered a brighter color and a fresh source of savory flavor, but it also introduced a serious weakness. Ketchup had finally found the ingredient that would define it, but turning that seasonal fruit into a safe commercial product would prove far more difficult. As tomato ketchup moved from household kitchens into commercial production, the weakness of its new identity became impossible to ignore. Tomatoes were seasonal, fragile, and quick to spoil. Factories often relied on bruised, overripe, or leftover fruit from the canning industry, while poor sanitation and inconsistent recipes allowed sealed bottles to ferment, swell, leak, or even burst. Some manufacturers used artificial dyes to disguise pale ingredients. Others added chemical preservatives to keep questionable sauces stable during transport. Ketchup had finally found the ingredient that would define its future. But the tomato had also created a crisis of trust. The industry could produce more sauce than ever before. It still could not guarantee that the sauce inside the bottle was clean, safe, or even honestly made. In 1876, Henry J. Heinz entered this uncertain market with a strategy built around visibility. Instead of hiding ketchup inside dark containers, his company sold it in clear glass bottles, allowing customers to inspect the color, thickness, and cleanliness of the sauce before buying it. Heinz also relied on ripe tomatoes, strong vinegar, sugar, salt, and spices to create a thicker, sweeter, and more acidic formula that could remain stable without depending as heavily on controversial preservatives. The clear bottle was more than packaging. It was a public challenge to competitors whose products looked safest when consumers could not see them. Heinz understood that in an age of suspicious factory food, cleanliness itself could become a brand, and trust could be manufactured as carefully as flavor. But Heinz's preservative-free ketchup soon entered a much larger struggle over who had the authority to decide what Americans were allowed to eat. At the center of that conflict was Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist at the United States Department of Agriculture. Through controversial human feeding experiments that newspapers called the Poison Squad, Wiley investigated additives used throughout the food industry, including sodium benzoate, a common preservative in bottled ketchup. Manufacturers argued that benzoate made mass production practical. Wiley feared it allowed companies to disguise dirty factories, inferior ingredients, and unsafe production methods. Heinz publicly supported the Pure Food movement, turning its formula into both a reform campaign and a commercial weapon against its rivals. The Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906 did not immediately settle every dispute over preservatives, but it changed the balance of power. Manufacturers now faced stronger federal oversight of adulterated and misbranded food, while consumers gained new expectations about what a factory-made product should reveal. Ketchup had changed again. This time, it was not adapting to a new ingredient or a new country. It was adapting to a new age of public distrust. What had begun as a fermented seasoning had become part of a national battle over science, regulation, corporate influence, and the meaning of safe food. Regulation did more than force manufacturers to clean up their factories and label their products more honestly. It also helped determine what ketchup was allowed to become. For most of its history, ketchup had never been one fixed recipe. It had been made from fermented fish in Asia, mushrooms and walnuts in Britain, and tomatoes in the United States. Its survival depended on flexibility. But as industrial production expanded, regulators and manufacturers needed clearer standards for labeling, safety, and consistency. In the United States, Ketchup gradually became legally associated with a tomato-based product made with vinegar, sweeteners, salt, and seasonings. The new standards protected consumers from misleading substitutes and made mass production easier to regulate. Yet they also created a historical irony. Tomato ketchup had once been only one branch of a much larger family of sauces. Now it had gained enough commercial and legal authority to define the entire category. Fish, mushroom, walnut, and later banana versions were treated as alternatives to the real product, even though ketchup had existed without tomatoes for centuries. The sauce that had survived by repeatedly changing its identity was now being fixed into a recognizable industrial formula. Regulation made ketchup safer, more predictable, and easier to sell. But it also narrowed the meaning of the word itself. From this point forward, the challenge was no longer deciding what ketchup should contain. The challenge was producing that approved flavor, color, and texture identically, on a scale no household kitchen could ever achieve. Once ketchup had become safer and more stable, the next challenge was scale. Factories needed every bottle to taste, look, and pour the same, no matter when the tomatoes were harvested or where the sauce was sold. Recipes were measured more precisely. Cooking times, acidity, sweetness, and thickness were controlled. Tomato growers increasingly supplied fruit for processing rather than the fresh market, while industrial equipment crushed, strained, concentrated, cooked, and bottled enormous quantities with far less variation than any household kitchen could achieve. This consistency created a new kind of power. Consumers no longer judged ketchup only by its ingredients. They judged it by whether it matched the flavor they already knew. A familiar label became a promise that the next bottle would taste like the last. Ketchup was no longer simply preserved tomato sauce. It had become a standardized industrial product, designed to travel farther, last longer, and reproduce the same experience in millions of homes. Ketchup's greatest expansion came when another industry began spreading across America: fast food. Burgers, hot dogs, French fries, and fried meat were rich, salty, and often heavy with fat. Ketchup added acidity to cut through that richness, sweetness to make the flavor instantly appealing, and a bright red color that made inexpensive meals look more exciting. More importantly, it was cheap, stable, and easy to distribute. Bottles appeared on diner counters, but growing restaurant chains demanded something even more efficient. Ketchup moved into pump dispensers, plastic containers, and single-serving packets that could travel with every takeaway meal. The sauce helped create a familiar taste that customers could recognize in different cities and eventually different countries. Fast food did not merely make ketchup more popular. It transformed ketchup into part of a global system, where the same flavor could be delivered quickly, cheaply, and almost identically billions of times. As American fast food chains expanded overseas, ketchup traveled with them. The red sauce became associated not only with burgers and fries, but with a broader image of modern American life: convenient, standardized, and instantly recognizable. Yet ketchup did not simply erase local tastes. In different countries, consumers mixed it with regional spices, used it on unfamiliar dishes, or demanded sweeter, sharper, or hotter versions. The same bottle could appear beside fried rice, grilled meat, noodles, pastries, or street food far removed from the American diner. This adaptability helped ketchup succeed where a rigid recipe might have failed. It offered a familiar balance of sweetness, acidity, salt, and savory flavor, while remaining flexible enough to enter new cuisines. The sauce that had once been reinvented by British cooks was being reinvented again. Global expansion did not make ketchup completely uniform. It created countless local versions of a supposedly universal condiment. Industrial brands were trying to make ketchup universal. But its history suggested the opposite. The sauce survived because local cultures kept changing it. Nowhere was ketchup's adaptability clearer than in the Philippines. Tomato ketchup had become popular during the period of American rule, but imported products were expensive, while the tropical climate made large-scale tomato production difficult. In the 1930s, Filipino food scientist Maria Ilagan Orosa developed a version made from an abundant local crop, bananas. Combined with vinegar, sugar, and spices, the fruit produced a sweet and tangy sauce that could perform much like tomato ketchup without depending on imported ingredients. Orosa's goal extended beyond creating a substitute. She worked to preserve local foods, reduce reliance on foreign goods, and build greater food independence for Filipino communities. Banana ketchup eventually became a national staple, served with fried chicken, meat, rice, and spaghetti. Its success revealed the real secret of ketchup's global survival. The product did not conquer new cultures by remaining unchanged. It succeeded because each culture could take the basic idea and remake it as its own. The story of banana ketchup soon entered a much darker chapter. When Japanese forces occupied the Philippines during the Second World War, Maria Orosa remained in Manila while many others fled. Her work was no longer simply about replacing imported foods. It became a matter of survival. Orosa and hundreds of students prepared nutrient-rich foods from local ingredients, while members of the resistance secretly carried supplies to prisoners held at Santo Tomas internment camp. Years spent studying preservation, canning, and food substitutes now helped people endure shortages, occupation, and isolation. Orosa was wounded during the Battle of Manila and died on February 13, 1945, after the hospital treating her was bombed. Her ketchup was only one part of a much larger legacy. But it revealed something important. Changing a familiar product could become an act of economic independence, and, during a crisis, a weapon against hunger itself. After the war, ketchup entered its age of mass consumption. Supermarkets expanded, suburban households bought more packaged food, and television advertising carried familiar brands into millions of living rooms. Companies built factories in new countries and placed ketchup beside frozen fries, canned meals, grilled meat, and increasingly popular convenience foods. The bottle became a permanent object on restaurant tables and refrigerator shelves, while brand loyalty made one company's flavor feel more correct than another's. This was a major shift in power. Ketchup no longer depended mainly on local recipes or seasonal tomatoes. Large manufacturers controlled the formula, packaging, advertising, and distribution systems that determined what consumers expected ketchup to taste like. A sauce once reinvented by sailors and household cooks was now being defined by corporations. Its success came from consistency. The same sweetness, acidity, color, and thickness repeated across cities, countries, and generations. Mass production did not stop at the factory gate. It reached backward into the fields and changed the tomato itself. Processing companies needed fruit that ripened at nearly the same time, contained more usable solids, and could survive being shaken from the vine by machines. Plant breeders therefore selected firmer tomatoes, with concentrated harvest periods and greater resistance to bruising and disease. In California, mechanical harvesting expanded rapidly during the 1960s, especially as the Bracero labor program ended and growers faced pressure to reduce dependence on hand-picking. Machines lowered harvesting time and made vast processing crops economically possible. But they also displaced many seasonal workers whose labor had built the industry. The ketchup bottle now began in a field designed for machinery, not for appearance on a grocery shelf. Industrial demand had done more than standardize the sauce. It had reshaped the crop, the farm, and the people required to harvest it. But the efficiency of industrial ketchup carried costs that disappeared inside the bottle. Processing tomatoes required large fields, irrigation systems, fertilizers, pesticides, harvesting machinery, and factories capable of boiling enormous volumes of fruit into concentrated paste. Water was removed to make transportation cheaper. Then the concentrate could be stored, shipped, and later mixed with vinegar, sugar, salt, and spices. This separated ketchup production from the tomato harvest itself. A bottle sold in one country might begin with concentrated tomatoes, grown and processed somewhere entirely different. The system reduced waste, extended shelf life, and allowed manufacturers to produce ketchup throughout the year. Yet it also concentrated control in companies that could afford contracts, machinery, storage, and global distribution. The household sauce had become part of an agricultural supply chain so large that the consumer could taste the final product without seeing the land, labor, water, or energy behind it. The single-serving packet completed ketchup's transformation into a product designed for movement. It was light, cheap, hygienic, and easy to place inside millions of takeaway bags. Restaurants no longer needed to wash bottles, refill dispensers, or trust customers to share the same container. But every convenient squeeze created a new piece of waste. Condiment packets are often made from thin layers of plastic, foil, and other materials fused together to protect the sauce from air and moisture. That structure makes them extremely difficult to separate and recycle, while their small size allows them to escape sorting systems entirely. Ketchup had once survived long voyages because fermentation and salt extended the life of food. Now it could travel almost anywhere because packaging protected each tiny serving. The sauce became more portable than ever, but the wrapper designed to last only a few seconds could remain in the environment far longer. Convenience also strengthened the power of a small number of global brands. Large fast food chains needed suppliers capable of producing enormous quantities, meeting strict safety standards, and delivering the same flavor to thousands of restaurants. That favored companies with vast factories, established distribution networks, and enough bargaining power to secure long-term contracts. Once a particular ketchup became tied to a famous burger or restaurant chain, the partnership reinforced both brands. Customers learned to associate one familiar sweetness and acidity with the meal itself. Smaller producers could offer unusual recipes, but they struggled to match the price, consistency, and reach of industrial suppliers. The bottle on the table looked simple, yet behind it stood contracts linking tomato growers, processing plants, packaging companies, transport firms, and restaurant corporations. Ketchup had become more than a sauce sold to consumers. It was now a strategic ingredient inside one of the world's most powerful food systems. Yet the global ketchup system still depended on one vulnerable biological fact: tomatoes need water, heat, and predictable harvest seasons. Major processing regions such as California rely heavily on irrigation, tying each bottle to reservoirs, groundwater, and increasingly contested supplies. Extreme heat can damage flowers, reduce fruit set, and shorten the window in which tomatoes reach the factory at the right quality. Drought does not automatically mean ketchup disappears, but it can raise farming costs, reduce yields, and expose how concentrated the industry has become. Seed companies and researchers are now developing varieties that tolerate higher temperatures, use water more efficiently, and remain firm during mechanical harvesting. The goal is not simply to protect a crop. It is to preserve a global food system built on the assumption that billions of tomatoes will ripen, be collected, and reach processing plants within a few crucial weeks every year. To protect that system, ketchup manufacturers are beginning to search for resilience at every stage. Farmers are testing drip irrigation, soil moisture monitoring, drought-tolerant varieties, and planting schedules designed around hotter seasons. Factories are working to reduce water and energy use, while brands experiment with lighter bottles, recyclable caps, and alternatives to difficult-to-recycle condiment packets. Some companies are also reformulating products with less sugar or salt, as consumers become more cautious about processed food. But every solution creates trade-offs. A tomato bred for heat resistance must still ripen evenly, survive machinery, deliver enough solids, and produce the familiar taste buyers expect. New packaging must protect the sauce for months, without becoming too expensive. Ketchup's future therefore depends on balancing biology, technology, cost, and habit. The industry can change almost everything behind the bottle, but only if consumers still recognize the flavor inside it. At the same time, some consumers are beginning to rediscover what industrial ketchup left behind. Small producers are making sauces from roasted tomatoes, fermented vegetables, beets, mushrooms, fruits, and regional spices. Restaurants experiment with house-made versions that are less sweet, more acidic, smokier, or deliberately uneven. These products cannot compete with global brands on price or consistency. But that is often the point. They remind people that ketchup was never originally one fixed recipe. For centuries, it changed whenever cooks encountered new ingredients, climates, and economic limits. The modern tomato bottle became dominant only because factories, advertising, and fast food made one version feel universal. Now, the growing interest in local ingredients and fermentation is reopening possibilities that industrial production once narrowed. Ketchup may appear standardized, but beneath the familiar red surface, it remains what it has always been: a flexible idea waiting to be reinvented. The next time a packet of ketchup is torn open over a tray of fries, the sauce may look entirely American: red, sweet, smooth, and familiar. Yet its journey began far from tomato fields and fast food counters, with fish, salt, fermentation, and sailors carrying unfamiliar flavors between Asian ports. Over centuries, each culture removed something from ketchup and added something new. Fish gave way to mushrooms, mushrooms to tomatoes, household recipes to factory formulas, and glass bottles to disposable packets. Along the way, ketchup passed through British kitchens, American food scandals, industrial regulation, agricultural engineering, and the global rise of fast food. What survived was never one ingredient or one fixed recipe, but a function: the ability to make simple food stronger, brighter, and easier to sell. Ketchup conquered the world not by protecting its original identity, but by repeatedly abandoning it. Each society reshaped the sauce to fit its crops, technology, laws, and commercial ambitions, until one tomato-based version became so dominant that the world forgot the others had ever existed. What appears to be a simple condiment is really the survivor of centuries of reinvention. And perhaps that is ketchup's greatest achievement. It changed almost everything about itself, until it became something billions of people could no longer imagine their food without.